in today's culture, where we don't like authority, we don't like absolutes, where does gospel proclamation sit today? Is it relevant still, and why is it relevant?
I tell the story often when I came to the church I'm serving at and was candidating, and there was a number of events, and at one of the events a young man, I don't know where he is now, he's a PhD student at the time, and came up to me and kind of saddled up, and I could tell he wanted to really challenge me on something, and just said,
He wanted to dialogue.
well, that's funny you say that, because what he asked was, if you're the pastor here, are you going to continue with these modernistic, monological, hierarchical forms of communication? Are you more open to postmodern, dialogical, conversant means of persuasion, or something like that? And I remember I just said, if you mean, am I going to preach for 45 minutes and everyone listen? Yeah, that's what I'm planning on doing. Because, again, it has to do with our theology of preaching and theology of authority. There is absolutely a time in the church for conversation, for dialogue. If we only have a model of discourse which is hortatory and declarative, and you sit down with your 13-year-old in your junior high youth group, and you're just, you're going to freak her out. Mm-hmm. And there's a time to say, oh, you have some really good questions. That's really good. Let's talk about that. But there has to be a time where God is speaking through a herald. Like Paul says that in 2 Timothy, that he was appointed a preacher, an apostle, and teacher. Those are all different words. So the word for preacher is kerux, which means a herald, one who declares a message on behalf of the king or some authority. And so that's what I see myself doing on Sunday morning. And I'm going to do it imperfectly. I often pray, even in front of the congregation, Lord, may these people hear a better sermon than the one I'm about to preach. And they need to listen, not because I'm smart or funny or have studied or am relevant. They need to listen because insofar as I'm speaking the Word of God, God is speaking to them. And we have a world where we hear from everyone and everything all the time on our phones and TVs, and we don't hear from God. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't seem too much to ask that people could be trained, you can't do it all at once sometimes, but could be trained to be seated, listen attentively for 15 and work up to 30, 45, maybe an hour, and hear God speak to them from His Word, because that's how He builds up the church. That's how He's always gathered His people. The Word of God is the seed of regeneration. So if we're not giving people the Word, we're not giving them God.
I was just reading in a book the other day. I just glanced at one of the paragraphs and talked about how we've never known so much about our universe, but yet felt so unsecure about who we are in our history. We've never known more about the human anatomy and biology, but never had more of an enigmatic picture of who we are. And one thing, and kind of coming back, we kind of keep coming back to this college age group, and this young, this generation of churchgoers that's coming up, is this idea of, and you were just mentioning, how do I hear from God? How do I know God's will in my life? How do I discern these things? And I just find it interesting, your progression of books where you've talked about church in your most recent one that came out a few weeks ago, Hole in Our Holiness now. It's gone from holistic church things now to the individual. And what is the connection with all of this? Like the gospel is the divinely inspired word of God. We've all heard from God. He speaks to us through His word, and that's the primary place where God communicates. And so what's the connection from this hearing God to our personal holiness, where between those things, this thing that we shroud in mystery is really much more clearer than sometimes we think? How am I to hear from God in according to who I should be, where I should be, what I should be?
We live in an absolute glut of information and a paucity of wisdom. So we know a lot, and if you have Google, you can know almost anything you want, but it doesn't make you wise. And yeah, I love the way you put it. We know all these things about the universe, but we don't know our place in the universe.
Technically, that was Kevin Van Hooser, but I could take credit if you want.
Oh, I mean, you, Kevin Van Hooser, Kevin DeYoung. I
Yeah.
mean,
It's a line. It's linear, right?
all the same.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a good observation about what the challenges are. But I think it also gives, and you touched on this, I think it also hits upon the opportunity that we have, that I think people are really hungry for substance.
Yeah.
And they might not know it. They may think all they want is style. But I think in a world of triviality, it makes people starved for transcendence. And that's one of the things that we can give people, and that I think we really shoot ourselves in the foot when we are afraid to go deep with people, even with younger people. We think, well, they can't really take that unless it involves marshmallows. They're not going to stick with us, or they're not going to listen. But the word, as you said, is clear.
Yet a movie can keep their interest for 2 hours now.
Oh yeah, for 3, or they can watch 4 football games on a Saturday and 3 more on a Sunday, and then say, sorry, I don't have any time to participate in the life
I don't
of
have
the
30
church.
minutes to hear about the doctrine of Christ.
Yeah, and it's really what Jesus talks about in Matthew 13 is the seed of the Word of God being choked out by all the worries of life and the concerns of this world, and I feel it in my own heart. There are so many people who go to church all the time, and it's not so much that they got a gambling addiction and they are seeking out adultery over here, although those things sadly happen. It's quote unquote normal, regular church people or students who want to love Jesus, call themselves Christians, and yet their life and their soul is so shriveled up with everything else. And I watch football and I cheer on football too, but so shriveled by everything else that God just gets cut out of it. And what happens on a Sunday when you hear the word powerfully proclaimed, or even if you hear the word limply proclaimed, but it's still the word, and you leave and 10 minutes later it's football and it's a meal and it's some funny cat video on YouTube or something, and it's just, that's, the seed is just gone.